castrated fresh revenge narrative with new characters avoiding forbidden names entirely, or castrated fresh revenge narrative with new characters avoiding forbidden names entirely. The pen was still warm from my brother's hand when he pressed it into mine, like he'd been gripping it for an hour rehearsing this. "Sign it," he said. "All of it. The house, the shares, the whole thing goes to me. We've already got a notary in the kitchen." We were standing in my grandmother's library, the room that still smelled like her, bergamot and old paper and the lemon oil the housekeeper used on the shelves. Her funeral had been 4 days earlier. The casseroles people brought were still stacked in the freezer, and here was my family, gathered around her writing desk like crows on a wire, holding out a stack of papers an inch thick. I set the pen down on the blotter. I didn't slam it. I just put it down the way you put down something that isn't yours. "No," I said. "I'm going to tell you exactly how that night came apart, and how I spend the next 5 months taking my family's whole glittering little world down to the foundation. But before I do, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had relatives who treated you like a wallet with a face, hit that like button. I want to know I'm not the only one." My name is Delia. I was 29 that winter. I'm a certified fraud examiner. I spend my days tracing money that doesn't want to be found, untangling shell companies and forged invoices for a bank's financial crimes unit. It is not a glamorous job. It is the opposite of glamorous. And in my family, that was the whole problem. My grandmother, Eleanor, built Hotline Industrial Supply out of a single warehouse on the south side of the county. By the time she died, she owned 58% of a company that moved valves and fittings and industrial fasteners across 6 states, plus a house in Lake Forest that the county had assessed at more than $3 million. She'd raised my father in that house. She'd watched my brother and me grow up in it on Sundays. And she'd left almost all of it to me. Not because she loved me more, though I think she did, because I was the only one who ever asked her about the business instead of the bank account. My brother, I'll call him my brother because that's all he ever was to me, a relationship and not a person, had spent the last 6 years calling himself a founder. His company was a wellness band, the kind that sells $400 supplement subscriptions with names like Clarity and Ascend. He'd raised a few million from venture investors on a pitch deck full of words that don't mean anything. He drove a leased G-Wagon. He posted videos of himself doing cold plunges. And as far as I could tell, he had never once turned a profit. "You're being childish," my mother said. She was sitting in Grandma's wingback chair like she'd already inherited it, in a cashmere coat she had not taken off because she wanted everyone to know it was real. "Your brother has a public profile to maintain. He has investors. What are you going to do with controlling shares in a pipe-fitting company, Delia? Sit in a warehouse with a clipboard? You don't belong in a place like this, and you never have." There it was. The same sentence, in different outfits, my whole life. You don't belong here. I was 4 years old the first time I heard a version of it, when I cried at my brother's birthday party and got sent to my room so I wouldn't ruin the photos. "Grandma left it to me," I said. "She put it in writing, she had it witnessed, there's nothing to discuss." My brother's jaw did the thing it does, that little flex. She wasn't in her right mind. Everyone knows that. You isolated her. You poisoned her against us. "I drove her to chemo every other Friday for 8 months, I said. "Where were you?" I shouldn't have said it. Not because it wasn't true, it was completely true, but because in my family the truth was a thing you got punished for. My mother stood up out of the chair so fast it rocked back against the bookshelf. She crossed the rug in 2 steps, and she slapped me across the face hard enough that I heard it before I felt it, a crack that bounced off the high ceiling and the glass front of the cabinet where Grandma kept her good china. My head snapped sideways. Heat bloomed across my cheek and into my ear, a high-ringing whine. I tasted copper where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. I stood there with my hand half raised, not even all the way to my face, frozen the way you freeze when something happens that part of you has been bracing for your entire life and the rest of you still can't believe. "You will sign that paper," my mother said, and her voice had gone somewhere ugly, somewhere her country club voice never went. "You don't get a choice. You've always been an ungrateful, jealous little disappointment, and you are not going to take this from your brother. Pick up the pen." My brother stood behind her with his arms folded and he smiled. "That's the part I keep, not the slap." The smile. He looked at me like I was a problem that had finally been solved. And that was their mistake, because they were so busy enjoying it that they'd completely forgotten about the man sitting in the corner by the window. His name was Mr. Whitfield. He was a senior partner at the firm that had represented my grandmother for 31 years, and he had been sitting in a leather club chair the entire time with a calfskin folder closed on his knee, watching, saying nothing. Now he stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He took off his reading glasses, folded them and slipped them into his breast pocket, and the small ordinary precision of it made the whole room go quiet before he'd said a single word. "Mrs. Mercer," he said to my mother. His voice was soft, almost kind. "Do you have the slightest idea who you just put your hands on?" My mother whipped around. "I struck my daughter in my own family's home, and it is none of your concern. Make yourself useful and notarize the transfer." Mr. Whitfield did not blink. He opened the folder. "This is not your family's home anymore, ma'am, and she is not only your daughter." He drew out a single page sealed with the firm's embossed stamp. "You are standing in Miss F. Mercer's house, drinking her coffee, and you have just committed battery against the controlling shareholder and chair-elect of the board of Heartline Industrial Supply. I witnessed it. So did 3 other people in this room." The silence in that library was a physical thing. I could hear the radiator ticking. My father, who had been leaning against the bookcase the whole time pretending to read the spines, the way he pretended to do everything, let out a short laugh that didn't have any air behind it. "You've got the wrong file, Whitfield. Or my mother lost her marbles at the end. Delia running Heartline." He shook his head like the idea was a fly. "She reconciles ledgers for a living. She's a clerk." "She's a forensic accountant with a federal designation," Mr. Whitfield said, "and your mother spent the last year of her life making sure the company she built would land in the hands of the only person in this family who never once asked her for money. I think hard about your next moves, all of you." I want to tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't, not yet. My cheek was on fire and my hands were shaking, and some small, pathetic, 29-year-old part of me still wanted my mother to say she was sorry. She wasn't going to. I knew that. But you spend your whole childhood waiting for an apology, and the waiting doesn't just turn off because you got a law degree's worth of leverage handed to you. So I did the thing the old me would never have done. I turned to Mr. Whitfield, and I made my voice as flat and clear as I could. "You saw her hit me." "I did." "I want it on the record. I'm going to file a police report tonight, and I'd like you to be available to give a statement." I looked at my mother while I said it. That was battery. There were witnesses. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen because we share a last name. The colour drained out of her face so fast it was almost funny. "In our family, you did not call the police on family. You absorbed it. You smiled at Thanksgiving. That was the deal nobody had ever asked me to agree to, and I was tearing it up in front of all of them." "You wouldn't dare," my mother whispered. "I already am," I said. I took out my phone and I took a picture of my own face, the red handprint. I could feel it raising up like a welt, and then I looked at all of them. My mother and my father and my brother's wife hovering in the doorway with her phone out like she'd been about to live stream my surrender. "Get out of my house," I said. "You have 1 hour to be off the property. After that I'm calling the sheriff's department, and trust me, by then they'll already know my name." My brother opened his mouth. I didn't let him. "Out," I said. They went, loudly, with threats, my mother sobbing the dry, theatrical sob she'd perfected over decades. But they went, and when the heavy front door finally clicked shut, and the house was mine and quiet, I sat down on the bottom stair in my grandmother's front hall, and I cried for about 90 seconds, and then I stopped, because I had work to do. I filed the report that night. The deputy was polite and a little bored until I gave him the witness's name and bar number, and then he got a lot less bored. I knew my family. I knew they would not walk away from a $30 million company with their tails between their legs. People like that never accept that they've lost. They double down. They escalate. The only question was how fast. It took them 9 days. I was at my desk at the bank, second coffee, grey Tuesday morning, when the front desk called up to say a courier had something he could only hand to me. I went down. He confirmed my name, handed me a thick manila envelope, said, "You've been served," in the tired voice of a man who said it 40 times a day, and left. I opened it with a letter opener at my desk, calmly, because panicking has never once helped me solve anything. It was a civil complaint, filed in the Circuit Court of Cook County. The plaintiffs were my mother, my father, and my brother. They were not just contesting the will. They were going for my throat: financial exploitation of an elderly person, undue influence, and fraudulent conveyance. According to the 70-page filing, drafted by an expensive litigation firm downtown, I had spent the last year of my grandmother's life cutting her off from her loving family, feeding a frail, dying woman lies, and manipulating her into signing away her legacy. They painted me as a predator, a cold, calculating woman who'd whacked an old lady on her deathbed. It was a beautiful piece of fiction. It was also, every single word of it, a lie. And I happened to have a folder full of dated, signed, physician-witnessed capacity evaluations my grandmother and Mr. Hev. Whitfield had quietly completed for exactly this reason, because Grandma had known precisely what her family was. My phone buzzed on the desk, a text from my brother. "I want you to understand the kind of man my brother is, so let me just give you what he wrote, more or less. He told me I had no idea what I was up against. He told me he had a litigation firm on retainer and the resources of his company behind him. He told me he would bury me in discovery, drown me in depositions, drag it out for years, and that I was a salaried nobody who couldn't afford to fight a man with a war chest. 'I'll spend every dollar Vantex has before I let you keep what's ours,' he wrote. 'Sign by Friday, or I'll make sure you're bankrupt and unemployable by spring.' A normal person would have read that and felt sick. I read it 3 times and felt something closer to gratitude. Because my brother, in his rage, in his absolute certainty that he was talking to a frightened little sister, had just put in writing that he intended to use the capital of a venture-backed company, money that belonged to outside investors, raised for a specific business purpose, to fund a personal family lawsuit. He'd just admitted in a text message to commingling investor funds with a private legal vendetta. That is not a family squabble. That is wire fraud. That is the kind of sentence the SEC frames and hangs on the wall. I forwarded the screenshot to Mr. Whitfield, and then I called him. "Good morning," he said. "I assume they filed." "This morning." And my brother just texted me a confession he doesn't know is a confession. I read it to him. There was a long pause, and then a dry sound that I realized was Mr. Whitfield laughing. "He's documented his own misconduct," he said. "That's actionable." "I know. Don't file the motion to dismiss yet." "Why not? We could have this thrown out in 3 weeks. "Because I don't want it thrown out in 3 weeks," I said. "I want him comfortable. I want him to think he's winning. Every dollar he spends fighting me out of that company's accounts is a dollar he's stealing from his own investors, and I want a nice fat paper trail of it before anyone tells him to stop. I had the authority to pull that trail, too. That was the part nobody in my family understood about what they'd inherited the day my grandmother died. Heartline Industrial Supply held a small revolving line of credit that my brother's company had quietly drawn against 18 months earlier. Grandma had co-signed it as a favor, back when she still believed her grandson might grow up. As the controlling shareholder of the lender, I had every legal right to order any entity carrying debt with us, and my brother's company was carrying our debt. I told Mr. Whitfield to sit on his hands and let them celebrate. Then I hung up, opened the forensic software I used to take apart embezzlers for a living, and started pulling the corporate filings of my brother's beautiful empty company. I expected sloppiness. I did not expect what I found. While I was building my case against him, I knew my mother wouldn't be sitting still either. She had never won a fight in a courtroom in her life, but she'd won 100 of them at the Onwensia Club over Chardonnay. If she couldn't take my company, she'd take my reputation. She didn't waste time. Within a week, the story she was telling had reached me secondhand from 3 different directions. My youngest daughter, she was telling everyone, dabbing at dry eyes, had isolated her dying mother-in-law, hired some quack to declare a senile woman competent, and stolen a family fortune out from under 3 generations. My father paid his part on the golf course, shaking his head sadly between holes. calling me a calculating opportunist who'd broken his wife's heart. They weren't venting. They were running a coordinated campaign to poison every well I might have a drink from. It worked faster than I thought it would. By the following Wednesday, I felt the temperature change at my own firm. Conversation stopped when I came down the hall. A senior partner pulled me into an empty conference room and mentioned, carefully, that a long-time client, a man it turned out who golfed with my father, had called to express concern about the ethics of the examiner handling his accounts. I sat across from that partner, and I'll be honest, my stomach was somewhere on my knees. The job was the one thing I had built entirely on my own, with no help from any of them, and they were trying to set it on fire to smoke me out. They wanted me broke and disgraced and isolated so I'd come crawling back, ready to hand over the shares in exchange for being let back inside the family. So I told the partner the truth, plainly. I told him my grandmother had left her estate to the only grandchild who'd shown up for her, that her family was contesting it, that there were dated capacity evaluations from her physicians on file, and that I would be more than happy to share them with anyone who asked. I told him my record was spotless and he could pull my files going back 6 years and find nothing. And then I told him the part that mattered, that the relative spreading these rumours was, at that very moment, the subject of an active fraud examination, and that I would strongly advise the firm not to attach its name to his version of events. He believed me. He'd worked with me for 6 years. That's the thing about building a real reputation instead of buying one. It holds when someone leans on it. My grandmother's company held when they leaned on it too. I drove out to the Hotline headquarters that Thursday, the low brick building off the interstate where I'd done my homework as a kid, and I met with the woman who'd been her chief financial officer for 19 years. Her name was Ramona, and she'd known my grandmother longer than I'd been alive. And when I walked into her office, she stood up and hugged me and said, "Honey, your grandmother told me a year ago this would happen. She left you a folder. It's in the fireproof cabinet." That folder is what broke the whole thing open. My grandmother, in the last months of her life, declining but sharp as a tack right up to the end, had started noticing money leaving the company that she could not account for. Small amounts at first. Then not small. A pattern of wire transfers, 18 of them over 14 months, routed through a vendor account that, when I traced it, did not exist. It was a shell, an LLC registered in Delaware with no operations, no employees. No purpose except to receive money from Heartline and pass it on to a company called Van Tix Holdings. My brother had been stealing from her. For more than a year, he'd set up a fake supplier, run $40,000 of the family business through it, and used it to keep his cold plunge empire from collapsing. And on 3 of the largest transfers, the authorizing signature was my grandmother's, except it wasn't. I'd seen her real signature on 1,000 documents in that house. This one had the loop on the wrong letter. He'd forged it. He'd forged a dying woman's name to steal from the company she'd spent 50 years building, and then he'd sued me for elder abuse. I sat in Ramona's office with that folder open on my lap, and I felt something I'd never felt before in my entire life around my family. Not fear. Not the old desperate hunger for their approval. I felt calm. The kind of calm a surgeon must feel right before the first cut, when the diagnosis is certain and the hands are steady. I called Mr. Whitfield and I told him to file the motion to dismiss now and to attach the medical evaluations. Then I told him about the shell company and the forged signatures and the $40,000, and he was quiet for a long moment. "Delia," he said, "this is no longer a civil matter." "I know." "This is the FBI's field office and the US attorney." "I know," I said. "I want to give them everything, but I want to do it right. I want the paper trail airtight before anyone knocks on a door." It took 6 weeks to build. 6 weeks of nights at my grandmother's writing desk, the same desk where my brother had shoved a pen at me, reconstructing every transaction. I pulled the bank records through proper channels. I documented the shell. I got a handwriting examiner to put in writing what I already knew about the forged signatures. I cross-referenced the wire dates against Van Tix's investor reports and found that my brother had been telling his venture backers the company was profitable in the exact same quarters he was secretly bleeding my grandmother's accounts to cover payroll. He'd lied to his investors and stolen from his grandmother to keep the lie alive. The whole shining thing was hollow, propped up by other people's money. And he'd had the nerve to call me a clerk. I almost didn't go through with it. I want to be honest about that, because the people in the comments who say she should have just walked away, blood is blood. I heard that voice too. There was one night, late, when I sat there with the whole case assembled in front of me, and I thought about my mother in a courtroom and my father, who was old now and softer than he used to be, and I thought, you could just take the company and the house and never speak to them again. You don't have to send your brother to prison. And then I pulled out the picture I'd taken of my own face that first night, the handprint, and I read my brother's text again, the one where he promised to make me bankrupt and unemployable, and I thought about the forged signature on a dying woman's documents, and I understood something I wish I'd understood at 19. Walking away quietly is a gift, and you only give that gift to people who would not use your back to climb. My family would have used my silence the way they used everything I ever gave them, as proof they could take more. So I made the call. The federal agents were professional and unhurried, which I'd come to learn is how that world actually works. No sirens, no kicked-in doors, just two people in good suits who asked careful questions and took the folder and said thank you. The grand jury did its work quietly over the following months, and here's the part that still feels unreal when I say it out loud. My brother had a launch event scheduled for his new product line, a big catered thing in a downtown event space, investors flown in, a step and repeat banner with the Van Tix logo, the whole performance. He was on stage. He was 3 minutes into his speech about trust. I'm not making that up. The theme of the keynote was trust, when two agents walked up the center aisle and asked him to step outside. He tried to laugh it off into the microphone. They did not laugh. They walked him out past his own investors, past the banner with his name on it, and the video of it was on the internet by dinner. The civil case against me had already been dismissed by then. Judges do not look kindly on a fraudulent conveyance claim filed by the person who actually committed the fraud. My mother's lawsuit collapsed. My father stopped golfing for a while, I heard, because the men he used to shake his head sadly with at the club were now shaking their heads sadly about him, and the rumours my mother had spread so carefully turned on her all at once, the way a current does, because the worst thing you can do in a world built on reputation is be publicly, federally wrong about which of your children was the criminal. My brother took a plea. Wire fraud, identity theft for the forged signatures, securities fraud for what he'd told his investors. He'll be a guest of the federal government for a good while. The shell company was unwound. The $940,000 came back to Heartline with interest where it belonged. Van Tix dissolved, its investors furious, its founder unavailable. My mother called me exactly once after that. She did not apologize. People like my mother do not have the equipment for it. She called to tell me that I had destroyed the family, that I was cruel, that my grandmother would be ashamed of me. I let her finish, and then I said the only thing I had left to say to her. You hit me in my own house and told me I had no choice. He forged a dead woman's name to rob her blind. I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped paying for the privilege of being your daughter. And I hung up and I blocked the number, and I have not heard from any of them since. I kept my grandmother's house. I run Heartline now. I took the chair seat that scared my father so much, and it turns out moving valves and fittings across 6 states is honest, satisfying work, and the people who work there are loyal because Eleanor taught them what loyalty was worth. Ramona still runs the numbers. The folks who showed up for me when it counted weren't the people who shared my blood. They were the witness who didn't look away, the CFO who kept a folder safe for a year, the partner at my firm who pulled my files and found nothing but the truth, the friend from my unit who answered the phone at midnight when I wasn't sure I could go through with it. That's the family I have now. The one I chose, the one that earned it, the one that has never once put a hand on my face or a forged signature on a page. I sat on my grandmother's back porch last week, the first warm evening of the spring, with a glass of her wine from the cellar she'd left me, and I thought about how long I spent believing that the word family was a debt I'd be paying my whole life. It isn't. Blood is not a permission slip. Nobody's owed just silence because they were in the delivery room. The cruelest thing you can do to people who only ever saw you as something to use is to stop being available to be used, to take everything they tried to take from you, square your shoulders, and walk into a life they don't get to be part of anymore. I poured the last of the wine, and I watched the light go down over the lake my grandmother loved, and for the first time in 29 years, the quiet didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like the most expensive thing I owned.